Naomi, will you marry me?
Yes, Jae-sung. Yes. Yes, I will.
The rain hadn't let up all evening, and through the glass wall of the penthouse lounge, I watched it streak the lights of Gangnam into long silver ribbons. I wasn't thinking about rain, though. I wasn't thinking about anything except the man kneeling in front of me and the small black box open between us, a diamond catching the candlelight like it had something to say. I didn't see Do-yeon standing outside the glass until much later, but I want to start there anyway at the doors, in the rain, roses dying in his fist, because to understand how satisfying that moment felt, you have to understand everything I survived to get there. You have to go back 3 years. I loved Do-yeon Baek the way you love your first real heartbreak completely, blindly, and far past the point where I should have known better. We met in my second year of graduate school in Seoul, where I'd arrived on a design fellowship, terrified and homesick and grateful for anyone who made the city feel a little smaller. Do-yeon was charming in the particular way of men who've never had to try very hard. He came from a respected but fading family name, the kind that still opened doors even after the money behind it had thinned to nothing, and he wore that name like a coat he refused to admit was full of holes. For 2 years, I built my life around covering for those holes. I covered for him when his temper flared over nothing a spilled drink, a delayed train, a waiter who addressed me before him. I covered for the whispers from his mother, who never once said my name without a pause before it, like she was deciding whether I deserved to be spoken of at all. I learned to shrink myself smaller at family dinners, to laugh a little quieter, to let his opinions stand in for my own, telling myself this was simply what love asked of a woman alone in a foreign country with no one else to lean on. I covered, most of all, for the late nights he couldn't explain, choosing to believe him every time, because the alternative that I'd built my entire life around a man who didn't actually value me felt like too large a grief to survive. It ended on a Tuesday, unglamorously, the way most real heartbreaks do. I found the messages on his laptop, not even hidden, just careless, the way men get when they've stopped believing anyone is watching closely enough to catch them. Another woman, older money. A family his mother had already met, already approved of, already welcomed with a warmth she'd never once extended to me. "You knew this wouldn't last forever," he said, not even looking up from his phone. "Be realistic, Naomi. You're not exactly who my family pictured for me." Something in me went very still and very quiet. "And who did they picture?" I asked. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence answered for him. I didn't cry in front of him. I saved that for the taxi ride home. And then, somewhere between the 4th red light and my apartment door, I made a decision that turned out to be the most important one of my life. I stopped saving my tears for anyone who'd never once earned the privilege of seeing them. That should have been the end of my story. A quiet resignation, a woman packing away her better instincts and going back to who she was before love made her small. But grief has strange timing, and 2 months after the breakup, half drowning in a part-time design contract that barely covered rent, I met a man at a secondhand bookstore who had no idea I was supposed to be invisible. He introduced himself simply as Jae-sung. Quiet, unassuming, dressed like someone who worked long hours in a modest office and went home to an even more modest apartment, not like someone who, as I'd only learn much later, quietly ran one of the largest conglomerates in the country. He talked to me about architecture and the particular ache of being far from home. He remembered small details I'd mentioned only once: my mother's favourite flower, the name of the street I grew up on, the way I took my coffee when I was anxious versus when I was calm. He never once made me feel like a compromise, an afterthought, or a secret to manage around his real life. It took 4 months of coffee, of long walks along the Han River, of him showing up exactly when I needed someone to and never once when I didn't, before I realized I hadn't thought about Do-yeon in weeks. It took another 6 before Jae-sung finally told me who he really was. "I should have told you sooner," he admitted, sitting across from me in a restaurant far too fine for either of us to have paid for on a design assistant's salary, except I now understood he could have bought the restaurant outright, staff and reputation included. "I didn't want you looking at me the way people usually do the moment they hear the family name. I wanted you to see me first. Just me. I should have been angry. A hidden identity, kept from me for months, was not a small thing. Instead, I felt something loosen in my chest that had been clenched for 2 years straight. Here was a man who'd hidden his power to make sure I loved him for the right reasons, the exact inverse of a man who'd hidden his cruelty until it was too late for me to leave safely. "You're the Chairman of Haejin Group," I said slowly, testing the words like they might not hold my weight. "I'm a man who's been trying to work up the nerve to ask you to stay in my life for good," he corrected gently, reaching across the table for my hand. "The company is just the thing I happen to run during the day. It isn't who I am when the day ends and I'm sitting across from you." It became, in time, the kind of love story my best friend Ireti made me retell at every video call, half in disbelief. "So let me get this straight," she laughed once. "You dated a broke rich boy who treated you like an inconvenience, and then you accidentally fell for an actual Korean billionaire who treats you like you hung the moon?" When you say it like that, I'm saying it exactly like that, because it's true. "And because somebody needs to say it out loud so you finally believe it," she said, softer now. "You deserve someone who chooses you on purpose, Naomi. Every single day. Not someone who only wants you back once he realizes what he lost." I hadn't fully understood how true that would turn out to be. Not yet. Because word travels strangely in small, tightly wound social circles, and it wasn't long before it reached Do-yeon first, as a rumor at some business dinner he'd been invited to purely on the strength of his family name. His ex was seeing someone connected, someone with real money behind him. He dismissed it at first, the way people dismiss things that threaten a version of themselves they've grown comfortable with. He assumed exaggeration, or worse, that I'd found some rebound to feel better about myself, something that would fizzle out inside a season. Then he saw the photograph. It was innocuous enough me at a charity gala, laughing beside a tall man in a dark suit, the caption beneath it naming him plainly, Jae-sung, Chairman of Haejin Group. I found out later he stared at that photo for a long time that night. Not because he was happy for me, because for the first time since the breakup, it occurred to him that I hadn't just survived losing him. I had thrived past him entirely, and without ever needing his permission to do it. Something ugly and familiar stirred in him, not love, not really, though he'd have called it that if you'd asked. It was closer to loss aversion, that particular sting of realizing a thing you discarded was worth far more than you ever gave it credit for. He told himself he missed me. He told himself he'd made a mistake, that people deserved second chances, that surely 2 years meant something. Both were technically true, though neither had much to do with actual love, and everything to do with the uncomfortable, ego-bruising feeling of watching someone you underestimated become someone you could no longer reach. So he did what men like Do-yeon do when their pride can't accept an ending. He decided to fix it. He found out where I'd be. He bought roses, red, dramatic, the kind meant to be seen from across a room, not chosen for me, but for the audience he imagined watching him win me back. I imagine he rehearsed a whole speech about growth and regret, and second chances in the elevator up to the 40th floor, certain that if he simply appeared, if he simply said the right things, the door I'd closed behind me would swing open again the way it always used to. He was still rehearsing that speech, I'd later learn, when he stepped out of the elevator and saw me through the glass, laughing at something Jae-sung had said, a ring box open on the counter between us. I hadn't noticed him yet. My hands were pressed to my mouth, eyes bright, as Jae-sung knelt not with the polished, camera-ready formality of a man performing for an audience, but with the simple, slightly nervous sincerity of someone who'd wanted to do this for a long time and could hardly believe the moment had finally arrived. "I know I came into your life quietly," he said, his voice unsteady in a way I'd never heard from him before. "I never wanted you loving a name or a company. I wanted you loving me. Just me, the way I got to have just you, before either of us knew what the world would try to make of us. And I hope that's exactly what happened." "It is," I whispered, tears slipping free before I could stop them. "It always was," Jae-sung, "from the very first day." "Then marry me," he said simply. "Let me spend the rest of my life making sure you never once feel like anyone's second choice again." It was only as I said yes softly, joyfully, the word I'd once been too broken to imagine saying to anyone that I glanced toward the door and saw him. Do-yeon, roses wilting in his fist, rain still clinging to his shoulders. standing frozen on the other side of the glass like a man watching his own reflection age 40 years in 4 seconds. For a moment, old habit made my chest tighten. Some smaller, younger version of me braced for the guilt he used to be so good at making me carry. But that version of me had been left behind a long time ago, in a different apartment, under a different man's name. I excused myself gently, walked to the door, and stepped into the hallway, pulling it closed behind me so the moment inside stayed protected, untouched by whatever this was about to become. Do-yun, Naomi. His voice cracked slightly. I came to talk. I made a mistake. I know I did. I've thought about it every single day since. You didn't come to talk, I said, not unkindly, just honestly, the way only someone who's finally healed can afford to be. You came because you heard I was happy, and it made you uncomfortable. That's not the same thing as missing me, Do-yun. That's missing the version of yourself who never had to work for anything. He opened his mouth to argue and found, for once, that he had nothing true to say in his own defense. I hope you find whatever it is you're actually looking for, I told him, and I meant it, which surprised even me. I really do. But it isn't me. It was never really me you wanted. It was the comfort of knowing I'd always be there if nothing better came along. It took me a long time, and a lot of tears I'm not ashamed of anymore, to stop mistaking that for love. I glanced once, briefly, toward the framed words above the door, the ones Jae-sung's late grandmother had hung there decades ago, the ones he'd once told me had guided every serious decision in his family's long history, long before either of us was born. Some doors close forever when you choose the wrong person. I hope you remember that, I said gently, nodding toward it. Not as a punishment, Do-yun. Just as the truth. Some doors don't reopen just because you finally decide you want what's on the other side of them. Then I turned, walked back through the glass doors, and let them close behind me softly, without slamming, without cruelty. Just final. I found out later he stood alone in that hallway for a long time, roses hanging useless at his side, rain still dripping from his hair onto the marble floor. I hope he finally understood, standing there really understood, in the way that only comes far too late to matter that some chances only knock once, and the sound of them walking away is the only closure some people are ever going to get. Jae-sung reached for my hand as I came back inside, searching my face gently for any sign of what it had cost me. Are you all right? I am, I said, and found, to my own quiet surprise, that I meant it completely. For the first time in a long time, I actually am. He lifted my hand and pressed a kiss to the ring, now resting on my finger. Then let's give him one thing to be grateful for, wherever he ends up. What's that? That he was ever fortunate enough to know you at all, even if he was foolish enough to let you go without a fight. 6 months later, under strings of warm light in a garden overlooking the same river we'd once walked along as near strangers, I married a man who had loved me quietly, long before he ever told me his name meant anything to anyone. Ireti stood beside me as maid of honor, crying harder than I was, insisting between hiccuped laughter that she'd called it since the bookstore story. Jae-sung's mother, who had welcomed me the way Do-yun's never had, wept openly through the vows and pulled me aside afterward to press a small jade pendant into my palm, her own mother's, she explained, meant for the daughter she'd always hoped to have. My son knew what he had the moment he met you, she said. It only took the rest of us a little longer to catch up. I'm glad we did, I thought, briefly, of a different mother, one who had never once said my name without a pause of doubt in front of it. I let the memory pass through me without flinching, the way old bruises stop aching once they've finally, fully healed. Somewhere across the city that same evening, I heard Do-yun sat alone in an apartment that had grown emptier with every year, having learned through mutual acquaintances that the wedding had happened, that it had been beautiful, that I had never looked happier in my life. I don't know if he ever figured out how to walk through a door that had already closed, not because it was locked, but because he was the one who chose, foolishly, to walk away from it first. No one at my wedding mentioned his name. He had, in the end, become nothing more than a lesson, the kind some people are fortunate enough to learn early, and others only learn once, standing alone in the rain, watching someone else's happiness confirm exactly what they'd thrown away. I stopped looking backward the night I chose to, and surrounded, for the first time in my life, by a love that never once asked me to be smaller, I never wanted to look back again.